Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Cut Chat with Birding with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. We are so thrilled to be here today, and we are all from the Extension family today. So joining us is Dr. Megan Clayton. She's our range specialist. She's out of the Corpus Christi area, and everyone, of course, we know. Maureen, sorry you don't get the fancy introduction anymore, Maureen. Oh wait, I had a quick. I have lost my thought. I was going somewhere with my introduction and it has whooshed right out of my brain. So anyways, nope, it's not there anymore. Dr. Clayton, give us a little bit about your background and kind of what you do in Extension.
Sure, absolutely. Well, like you said, I'm stationed at the Corpus Christi Research and Extension Center, and I'm with the Department of Rangeland, Wildlife, and Fisheries Management at Texas A&M in College Station. And my job is one of the best kept secrets, I feel like, because I get to do research on mostly private lands and come up with solutions for some of our range management problems. And my specialties revolve around managing land for livestock and wildlife on the same piece of property, because that's a very popular set of goals today.
Very, very true. Very true. Okay. So today we are going beyond the birds and we are talking about plants, something that we all know Emily doesn't necessarily love. I would much rather talk about the livestock part of your job, Megan.
Yes.
But we really think that plants, and this is kind of a neat one, because if you don't know the plants around you a little bit, it's really hard to find the birds in the plants. And also, as we go to making that case for identification, when we're talking about where these plants or these birds live, some of them like different types of plants to live on. So Maureen, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, definitely. So let's start with talking about what are some of the common trees and brush that birds in Texas will use.
Well, I think it's important to consider that the brush is used in different trees, or used in different ways by birds. So the most common thing.
Let's do some definitions real quick. Can you tell us what we're going to mean when we say trees, when we say brush, and when we say woody? What do all of those things mean?
Sure. So trees, sometimes a plant can be a tree form, or it may have been manipulated in some way to where it's growing more like a bush or a brush plant. Brush typically doesn't get very tall, but it can. It just usually doesn't have a single trunk that's really large, like we think of a lot of our larger trees like the live oak. So that's kind of a fluid term between trees and brush. And a lot of times a shorter stature, a bushier form would indicate more of a brush species. So that is a little bit confusing, but both are utilized in similar ways and can provide lots of structure and shelter for birds. And obviously they relish this. What's cool, I think, is that a lot of our systems are built around birds moving these seeds. So we know that in South Texas, we might have a single mesquite tree in a field, and after the birds come and land in that tree and they're pooping out those seeds, that mesquite tree has created an environment that is favorable for those different brush species to come up. So birds, in some ways, make their own habitat. And so soon that becomes more of a motte of brush, what we refer to as a motte. And so those are used for escape cover from predators, and of course, shelter for them, where it creates more of a microclimate. It's got different temperatures under there where everything's shaded out. So I think the relationship between brush or trees and birds is really fascinating because it's multi-layered, it's very deep.
Yeah, that's kind of a good point, that they take those resources elsewhere, just like we can see with mammals doing. They're going to eat something and then that'll get moved around. And just the reason that you'll talk to people about if they're fighting with vines and brush on their fences, well, why are they there? Because birds sit on fences and poop out the seeds. So
that's right. And so I guess on fence lines, that might be looked at a little bit more negatively, but sometimes in a pasture where we find the most plant diversity is underneath the trees. And I think a lot of that might have to do with our birds that bring in those seeds.
Yeah. And that's just so interesting to me, that a bird can eat something, poop it out, and it grows. And I literally can't grow anything that I plant in a pot and take care of. I mean,
I'm going to reserve a comment that's in my head right now, but yes, in fact, just like our livestock, sometimes when these seeds are eaten, they're a little bit called scarified, roughed up. And then it's put out in sort of organic matter. And so sometimes they're actually planting them even better than the tree would have planted them themselves had they not had eaten them. So
Yeah,
you're
there's
right.
some plants
It's very
that
interesting.
really some plants really rely on that, right? Whether it's from being eaten or from like fire, like those seeds have to be, do you say scarified or scarified? I always say it wrong. You said scarified?
I don't think it matters. I have a bad accent.
Well, I don't know I don't do plants enough to know, but yeah, if the seed has to get scarified, and that's something when I was working on Great Salt Lake, some of the bulrush seeds like really, really need that to grow.
Sure.
And so as they're looking at there's an exotic plant up there. So as they're like fighting back that native plant and looking at like encouraging the bulrushes, they need that. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. And I mean, as Maureen has pointed out to me before, trees are also used as great bird locators because you can say, you see when you're birding, you see a bird in a certain tree and automatically people can know what part of the field to go look at. So I think it's neat that they're utilizing them. They're getting food from them. And of course, they're planting seeds underneath that's going to provide more food for a lot of our wildlife species.
Well, and
Yeah,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I just think that that's kind of funny. Like you talked about us using them when we're birding. And I think that's the main reason we really wanted to talk to you today about what some of those most common trees are that we're going to see in Texas, and that maybe we need to know when we're out birding to make sure that we can help everyone identify the tree. If you're like me, if I don't know the tree, I'm just like the green tree.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing when you're, okay, so I'm going to maybe jump to a different question, but just like we talked about making the case for bird ID, we use lots of different clues. Because when you get your bird guide, oh yeah, just look in your bird guide. Oh yeah, there's just 100 different species of birds to look through.
Absolutely, yep.
How to find the bird in the bird guide is kind of like finding a word in the dictionary when your teacher goes, oh, look that up in the dictionary. Well, I don't even know what the first 3 letters are, lady, so it's not going to help me.
Right. No, I totally agree.
Plant ID without just Googling the green tree with leaves.
Okay, that's a great question because I'm actually not a birder. I know quite a few birds, but I'm not a birder. And bird books are a little bit intimidating to me. And so some of your viewers might find that entertaining because plant books might be intimidating to them. And plant people are also very strange, like birding people. We have all these terms we use that everyone doesn't use in their common language. So even when you start reading about a tree to try to figure out if that's the right one, it could be a little daunting as far as doing that. But mostly, you're looking at tree shape. That's going to be a clue. The color of the leaves is definitely a clue. So you are valid in saying green. You might just add limey green or dark green to the front of that. And then the bark is actually a really great characteristic to look at as well, because there's quite a few trees who have different bark. But if you're starting out and you just want something on your phone or your tablet to carry with you, there are some cool apps. So I would suggest, first of all, a pretty new app that came out from Texas Forest Service is My Tree ID, and that's free for Android and Apple products. That one is fantastic, and you can even add your own pictures into that app. It even has a tree age estimator, which I get asked a lot of times how people would estimate the age of their tree because they just find it very fascinating. I'd also send you to a couple of apps depending on where you are in the state, either West Texas wildflowers or East Texas wildflowers. And those also include trees, but they have thousands and thousands of plants on there. So that's another good place to start. And then, of course, if you're familiar with iNaturalist, you might know that they have an app called Seek, which you can take a picture of the plant and it will pull up one in its database if it has one loaded that's similar to that tree. Sometimes those work, sometimes they don't. Just to be honest with you, Google Lens is actually pretty good at least getting you down. That one's pretty cool, right? You just take a picture and it searches all of Google to find something that's similar. And sometimes it's not exactly the right tree, but you're in the right, genre, for example. So at least you know to go to that genus and look at what trees might be in your area. And I always send people, I have to include this, I always send people to rangeplants.tamu.edu. That's our unit's online herbarium, and that has a lot of the trees that are common in Texas. So that's the places I would go if you're going out into the field and you don't want to carry a bunch of books. Those are some pretty good apps.
So question on when you're taking a picture, can it do like if I get a picture of the whole tree, or is it going to be better if I get the leaf or the bark?
Good question. It varies. And, you know, I get sent a lot of so-so plant pictures of people wanting me to identify them. And I'll just try different angles until it might pick up something, or see if a different angle picks up something different. So, you know, you're off if you take a picture and it's coming up with like a band plume for somebody's hat. But usually a very far off picture is going to be hard for Google to identify that. You'll need to be up a little bit closer. But, you know, so there are some characteristics of trees that you could identify from a distance.
So I did recently, my sister lives up in Washington, and she sent me a picture of this huge leaf that they found on a walk. And I actually just put it into iNaturalist. Like I put their location-ish, and then I pulled it up on iNaturalist, and it was a big leaf maple. We guessed that it was a maple, and it was funny because it was a great big leaf, and so it was, you know, a big leaf maple. But the iNaturalist algorithm for identifying actually worked pretty well too. So that's one
great
more
to know.
Sneak in there that I use it just because that's what's already on my phone, and I use it for insects a lot of the time.
Okay.
But for plants, at least it'll do like you're saying. It'll at least get you to the right genus, and then if you've got a book with you, you can like get a little closer from there. So
absolutely, yep, great tip. I bet your sister-in-law thought you made up that name.
No, it was funny because we were all like, "Oh look, big leaf," and I think it's a maple. What is it? It's a big leaf maple. So, but hey, it's descriptive, right? Like that's why we come up with names.
Sometimes they give good names to plants. Other times it's some random person that discovered it. So you wonder how they ever got attached to that name. But
so that actually, I just thought of this. Why is honey mesquite honey mesquite? Does it have honey?
Well, it does have a sap. Hopefully you haven't discovered that, you know, by the sap going onto your car. But it definitely does put out a sap. So perhaps that's why. But, you know, we have quite a few mesquites in Texas, especially as you go further west. But the most common one that pretty much all of the state has is honey mesquite. So that's more than likely the one you're talking about. Y'all want to talk a little bit about characteristics of some of our more common plants?
We're ready.
Yes, but I have a question for you. Well, this kind of ties into characteristics. Not a question, but just something I wanted to point out that you said. So I like that you talking about, you know, the shape of the leaves, what the bark looks like, you know, the growth form of the tree, right? Like if it's, you know, 100 feet tall, there's certain things that it won't be. Something that you said that I did take dendrology in college. It's been a long, long time, but I have taken a course about trees, dendrology, which is the study of trees. And before I took that course, I never realized how many trees like were on A&M campus. Like I took that course and I was like, oh my gosh, that one's different, and that one's different, and that one's different. And we say this sometimes, I think, with birds, like you never realize how many birds are around you until you start to learn birds. And I've heard it said, like, you never realize how many shades of green there are until you learn to identify trees. And so you said, you know, you said the green tree, but just qualify it. And that's so true. Like, is it lime green? Is it dark green? Is it kind of a pale dusty green? Like you have to get a little bit, you have to pull out your big box, your 96 box of Crayola crayons, but it's true. And that's kind of one of the things that's fun to me about whether you're learning more about birds or more about trees or anything, you start to learn those differences and then you realize how many there are.
Yep. Yeah. The diversity also could explain a lot about the diversity of the birds that are in that area, which is interesting. But you know, you're right. Like you can talk about shiny leaves or dull leaves, a lot of different options. When at first you thought they were all green trees. But you know, for example, we're talking about honey mesquite. Honey mesquite is interesting because when you pull a leaf of honey mesquite off, it actually shakes because it has leaflets on it. That's one whole leaf. And that makes the tree, to me, when it's moving in the wind, look like it's moving a little bit more differently than if you had one solid leaf, if that makes sense. And of course, mesquite also has those long beans that it puts on during the year. So, and it grows kind of like a big sprawling tree. So depending on if it's been cut off, it may have multiple stems, but when it's first growing, it's a single stem tree. So there's different variations, but in general, people are pretty good at identifying mesquite. Then when you move further east, you run into a plant called huisach, which is spelled like huisachi. Huisach is more of a cone-shaped tree. So it's going to go up and then have kind of a cone or upside down triangle shape. And it has paired thorns as opposed to mesquite's long single thorns. So they're usually smaller, but they're paired. And those leaves are twice compounded. So instead of just splitting once with leaflets, those leaflets split again with leaves. So all of its leaves are super tiny. So a lot of times a mesquite might look more dark than a huisach tree. And, depending on what's growing in the area where you're birding, I think you could very easily start to identify and learn those more common trees, and don't even worry about the rare ones. And those will come later on. So don't get overwhelmed with trying to learn everything that's on the place.
So if you
Okay,
could
so
tell
I'm glad.
me maybe,
Go ahead.
so like, what are like 5 common trees in Texas that somebody should know? Like,
Oh, okay. Wait, I got to comment on the mesquite versus the huisach, because I'm so glad you described the shape, because that's one that I had just never articulated before. Like, because we have both of those. I see both of those a lot, and I can tell the difference.
Yep.
But sometimes there's those things that you just don't put into words, right? Like, you're like, I just know that it's different. And
That's what a terrible answer, right?
Right.
Because it's clearly huisach.
Right.
Like, well, and they also change color. Those leaves will change color throughout the year. So it's important to be kind to yourself and start to notice them through different seasons too, because they could look different.
Well, because before you said that the mesquite looks darker, I was thinking, I feel like the huisach usually looks darker.
I was on the vote with that. I was voting huisach is darker.
And you know what? Huisach actually has a darker kind of brownish red bark. So sometimes that's something that people can go off of, whereas you probably know what a mesquite bark looks like, kind of classic tree-ish. So there are some subtle differences to where, depending on the time of the year, you can definitely pick out one from the other. But to Emily's question, I'm not sure we can cover all the trees, but here's another cool, like, little group of trees that are really confusing. So people talk about the junipers or cedar. Sometimes they call them cedar, even though the juniper, like a blueberry juniper, is not a true cedar. But there's blueberry juniper,
so
there's redberry.
So our cedar trees that we call in the hill country of cedar, they're not really cedar.
They're not really, they're junipers, but everyone knows what we're talking about, so it doesn't really matter. But we have the blueberry juniper, the redberry juniper.
I just thought they were really cedar. I mean, like, I've never ever called them anything else but cedar. Fun fact,
we do have a cedar. We have eastern red cedar when you go a little bit further east, obviously. So that one was also appropriately named. You go further east, you see the eastern red cedar. And the blueberry juniper and the eastern red cedar are not resprouters, which from a management standpoint makes them so much easier, right? Because you could cut them off and not worry about them coming back from the base with multiple stems. But we know there's a few characteristics, even if you're a long ways off and you have no berries on the plant, because obviously blueberries can have blueberries and red berries can have red berries. But that blueberry juniper or the ash juniper, the limbs come mainly from the main trunk. And so it literally kind of grows more straight up, although you can have a form that's had something done to it and it's smaller. And those limbs are very straight. Those are the ones that people usually seek after for the fence posts. So blueberry juniper, very straight. And then it's got that dark gray, dark brown bark. And if you're in doubt and you get up to the plant, you can always crush it, and the leaves are going to smell like Vicks vapor rub, like that you put in your nose, because it literally has this cedar oil as a component. But when we look at redberry juniper, redberry doesn't develop a central stem, so it looks very bushy, right? So even from a distance, it's very bushy. And the key characteristic is that unless you've just recently had a rainfall, it's going to have that rosin on the gland that's gland producing. It's like a white speck on its leaves. And that waxy speck is characteristic of red-berry juniper. And then if you crush its leaves, it's going to smell like machine oil. So that's an easy way to tell those two apart. Whereas Eastern red cedar, it's further east, obviously, it looks more like a Christmas tree. In fact, people use it as Christmas trees. It's not a resprouter again. So you'll probably see it always as that single stem and a kind of a beautiful Christmas tree shape. And when you crush the leaves, it's going to smell like, can y'all guess?
Christmas.
A Christmas tree, yeah. So that one's easy. So those are three that people get really confused about, but they're really quite easy to tell apart just by the way that they're growing a lot of times.
Let's jump. Okay, so I've got a few fun facts for everybody out there, and Megan may know them, but hopefully Maureen doesn't. So maybe it's a few fun facts. Did you know that there is a cedar oil mill in Texas?
No, do they make Vicks VapoRub?
No, they just make the oil, and so it's in the most random place. And we actually have a person joining us today from the county where the cedar oil mill is.
Cool. Tell us.
So it is in Real County.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, and
that's very appropriately placed, isn't it?
Yeah,
it is. That's so cool.
Yeah. So, and it was really fun. We went to go visit the other day, and they will pay farmers and ranchers for their cedar if they're chopping it down. They have a few requirements, blah, blah, blah. But then they run it through their machinery and they can make all the different wood products from it. But their final product is cedar oil. And they make, one young lady who works there on site has made some perfumes. So right outside of it's right outside of Lakey. Megan, you may need to put it on your bucket list to go see it.
That would be fun.
And the probably wrong here, but I believe the people who own it originally come from France or somewhere overseas and kind of brought that to Lakey, and that was kind of a neat thing. So
that's awesome.
That's so cool. That's like half an hour away from me. I need to go see that.
Yes, it was a really neat experience. Now, the other thing that I think we should discuss, and we're just going to have a brief range management lesson here. And so it's not going to all be birding, but we're going to let Megan, which I think is something that maybe most people don't know and don't understand. Because when you were talking about the mesquites, you were talking about how some mesquites can have one stem and some of them have multiple stems. And that can be the same for like Weisach as well, right? Yep. Maybe, yes. Yeah. Can you share the principle and the explanation of why we don't just cut a mesquite down or Weisach tree down?
Sure, yeah. So we have two kinds of trees in Texas, resprouters or non-resprouters. And the resprouters means that underneath that soil surface, there's this section or a ball, depends on the tree, that has buds on it. So we call that the bud zone. And there's this thing, this is getting a little too deep, but there's this thing called apical dominance, where they're secreting a hormone, right? They being the tree, not me. They're secreting a hormone and it's suppressing those buds from growing, from sprouting a stem. And when the top is removed in any way, so shredding, burning, anything that would putting the inappropriate chemical on it, anything that's going to burn the top but not kill the root, will remove that apical dominance on the top. And so then those buds are allowed to resprout. So when mesquite or Weisach or a number of trees are young, they may have a single stem, but after it's been manipulated in some way, you can tell because then it has multiple stems. And sometimes when you walk up on a tree, honestly, you know, where it's like, is that one tree or 8 trees? More than likely, they all come back together at that single stem with the buds in what I call kind of the saddle area, where they're all coming back together to that single root system that's still the size of the original age of that tree. So every time we shred trees, it makes it a little bit more difficult to control because you have all these stems you're trying to get to consistently move chemical down to that bud zone to control the tree. So it's a little bit of a mess, but that's why you're right. There's different forms. Like you can have what people call a big bull mesquite, a big single stem shady tree. And you can also have a bunch of junk mesquite that's very multi-stemmed and even only a couple of feet tall that people have run over a lot.
Well, and I think that's kind of important because, even just, where I used to live, mesquites were a favorable tree if you had like a big mesquite. My
Absolutely.
yard had a big mesquite, and it was the only tree I was going to have in my yard. And
Yep.
so one thing that I think is important is if you in your yard need a big mesquite, or you want a mesquite outside your window or something to grow, but you can't do that cut. I think that that's
Right.
something that we always, that if we don't understand that principle and you do that cut thinking you're going to get rid of it, then you get something worse.
Yeah. So if you're going to cut it, then we do have practices to where you can treat that cut stump to control those buds so that they don't resprout. But you're right. And a lot of times people prefer those larger single stem trees because they do provide more shade than the multi-stem trees. And it all goes back to management and how you've treated that property.
Well, and this is important for when we're talking about knowing what tree you're looking at, like if there's a bird sitting in it, of just that a single stem mesquite and a multi-stem mesquite look really different. And so you might say, okay, there's a bird in the top of that tree, and single versus multi, that's still a mesquite. But you could also say there's a bird in the top of that multi-stem. If you're looking out at a whole bunch of mesquite, which is pretty typical where I am, and there's one that's single stem, and that's where the bird is, like that's a pretty easy way to get everybody. That's
a great point.
On where
or the jump tree just to the left of the single stem tree. Yeah, that's valid too.
So and brush are really common where I am. Brush are great, but can you talk a little bit about some of the other, like the big trees, like the live oaks and pecans and elms and ash and all these things? What are some of the other ones that we might distinguish, especially because birds love these?
Yes, absolutely.
And the birds we love those.
The birds we love these. Yes,
that's right. I don't know about y'all, but our live oaks are producing acorns like crazy this year. Have you noticed that?
Yes. Yeah.
We have acorns everywhere, which is interesting.
And last
because
year we had like none, and this year we had a ton. And I hate them because my dogs eat them and then they get sick. But they're up here. We're farther north than you, so we're mostly done by now.
Well, it's interesting you said that because they can be toxic, and a lot of our wildlife relish them. In fact, that's probably what get them through a lot of our fall and winter months, because there's not a whole lot of hard mast available here in South Texas anyhow. But yeah, live oak is a beautiful
tree. I tell my
tree.
dogs that they're toxic and they don't listen to me. So
shame on you. Need to
they
learn
just
dog.
Eat them and throw them off to my house. So
you need to learn how to speak dog. You think they would learn, right? But they must have something in them that is attractive for them, but they've got a lot of tannins, which sort of binds things up, and probably why it makes them feel really ill. But they're also toxic to livestock if they eat enough of them from the gallotannins that's in them. But yeah, the live oaks are cool because they have those irregular limbs, and so sometimes they have a really cool limb that you can use to kind of point out where the bird is, because they grow really funky, which is probably why a lot of people like live oaks. But we also have hackberries, and hackberries, there's actually 5 species of hackberry in Texas, and I think all but one are actual trees. But we also have spiny hackberry in South Texas that's called granjeño, which produces a great fruit, actually, that birds love. But our typical hackberry that people think of is the sugar hackberry. It's got the big leaves that are kind of held on where it's almost like it's bent in half the way it's hanging, and it has really smooth gray bark that as it gets older, it creates these small bumps or little like wart looking things on the trunk of the hackberry tree. And they also produce kind of a reddish fruit that hang, and they persist throughout the winter, which is sometimes a really good characteristic that you could point out, because those pretty red berries are there even during our holiday time. I think, well, pecan, you mentioned pecan. Pecans, of course, typically occur near water areas like rivers or streams or creeks. They like to be around water. They have those really kind of like long linear leaves that come to a really sharp point, and they can be kind of wavy looking on the edges. But they are fairly flat, as opposed to, I was talking about the hackberry tree where it kind of hangs to where it looks like it's a little bit folded.
Okay, so talking about the pecans and that they like to be in wet areas, that brings up an important point. And actually, I just had a question on this yesterday with a bird, but with birds, they can fly. And so we sometimes find them far outside of their normal range. And you've been talking about some plants that are like more Eastern or more Western.
Yeah.
Do we sometimes find plants outside of their range is the first question. And then do we sometimes find them like, will I find a pecan in a not dry area sometimes? Will that ever confuse me? Or is it like, okay, it's dry here, that's not a pecan?
Well, I think what can be more confusing is that our land is so different. So it's possible that you could find a pecan and not know that you're in an area that holds water or is occasionally flooded. And so it is possible to see a pecan and think that's super weird, but I'm secretly a soils nerd. I know it's like the most boring thing you could probably think of, but soils are fascinating. Like I've talked to people who've said all of these plants grow right here and they're different and they hold the water there. I'm like, actually, if you look at your soils, you have different soils there that are more water holding, more clay content. And so it's created that environment to where those plants have persisted there, whereas they can't persist right next door on a sandier soil. So sometimes when we're confused about our plants, we can trace that back to the soils that are underneath them and the reason that they are there. So typically you're not going to see a pecan in a dry area, but you know, we're talking wild pecan, by the way. But us humans have messed a lot of stuff up and we've planted things where they don't belong and artificially helped them get to a point to where they can grow. So it is always possible to see something in a weird situation, but generally your eye's going to kind of get trained to know what should be in an area. And I think that's how a lot of people who are really good at plants ID, they just are really good at knowing what should be there. And it turns out that it is. And so they look like complete geniuses, but it's really just starting to learn those soils and what plant communities persist in them.
That's a good point. Well, and I think that the more time you spend in a certain location, and especially like the difference between, so I lived in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and then I moved to South Texas. The difference in plants between South Texas and the Dallas-Fort Worth area, completely different.
Yes.
Some of them were same, but like I had never seen Weesach before. And I had never seen, I'd seen Sinisa, but we didn't call it Sinisa, and it was planted in flower beds.
Right. Yep. It's like a pretty purple sage.
Yeah. And so, that's kind of one of those things that, depending upon where you are, and if you travel a lot, that's definitely more difficult, but it's definitely convenient if you can learn your plants in your home county. And that's what we talk about being a birder, and we kind of, intermediate, beginner birder. Beginner birder can identify the birds that they typically see in their backyard or around their town. And then when you start traveling, that plant species and that plant diversity is going to change, and understanding and kind of learning some of those as you go on your travels. Maybe that's a good goal. Maybe you should learn one new plant everywhere you go.
Well, I think birders are naturally curious and like a good challenge because birds are hard. There are a lot of different birds and they don't always cooperate for you to see their best features, whereas a plant doesn't really move. So I would think that most birders would be curious about at least the dominant trees in an area and why they do so well in that area and not other parts of Texas. So I agree. It should be something that we're naturally learning. And the same with plant people learning about the wildlife that utilize those type of habitats.
That's something I love about plants is if I don't know what it is, it's not going to run away when I go up to take a picture. And if I take a bad picture and send it to Megan and she's like, hey, you need to take a better picture, I can go back and it's still there. Or I can bring a friend and be like, hey, plant friend, what is this? Because it's not going anywhere. So bonuses of trees compared to birds.
That's true. A forb may be gone when you go right back to find it again, but yeah, a tree should be there.
Trees should be there. Yeah.
So
if it's not there, you're probably lost.
We are hitting the 8 o'clock hour, so we are thankful that everyone has joined us this morning. We have one last fun question for everyone.
No, I have one last real question. Is there anything we missed? Like, did we miss a tree that perhaps, I just want to check that there's not one that you're like, no, you need to know this.
There are so many, especially when you start moving south and or southwest with your white brush, which does not have thorns. So that's an excellent characteristic because so many of our things have thorns. We have black brush. The diversity of trees is amazing, but maybe I could point out if someone's really truly interested, check out like my favorite brush book is Common Woody Plants and Cacti of South Texas, and it'll have a lot that are in other areas. But if you're specifically in the hill country, you might check out the Tree, Shrubs, and Vines of the Texas Hill Country. Those are a couple of really great tree-centric books that aren't too overwhelming, that have some pretty cool information about them with the historical uses of the tree even.
That's true. Well, so now can we go to the fun question and wrap up for the day, Maureen?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you, Megan, for joining us, and everybody out there for joining us. And so we have one last fun question of the day, and so I've just put that in the comments. So let us know what your answer is if you're joining us. We'll start with Megan. Maureen, do you want to ask? You made the fun question of the day.
I did. Yes, I was pretty excited about this fun question. Lots of people like to say, what's your favorite bird? But Megan, what's your favorite tree?
Okay, well, it makes me laugh because us range specialists have trees that we dislike more than like, but my favorite tree is the wild olive, and it's such a pretty tree. It has a beautiful white bloom on it. It attracts hummingbirds and all kinds of pollinators, and this tree does not become invasive, and so it's always playing well with others, and maybe I also like it for that reason. But it has a really cool unique trunk, and it's got kind of like a gray-green leaf that's really soft, and even livestock love it. In fact, we have one in our backyard, and our it's sort of more of a shrub because anyway, a deer got in there and messed it up. But when we let our goats out to graze just for a little bit in the evening, they run immediately for that tree. They relish the wild olive tree, and of course we've tried to keep them out of it because we want to preserve it, but everything eats that tree, and pollinators love it, and so I think that's why I would put it as my number one.
Oh, that's a good one.
And they're related to what is that people plant in their gardens that also has that soft leaf? Aren't they? There's and that kind of similar flower. I'm totally drawing a blank on the name.
Is it green too?
It's green also, and it's got those fuzzy leaves, and my mom used to plant it in our garden when we were growing up, and it's gone. But I thought that's an excellent one. I love those. Those are beautiful trees. So
Maureen, what is your favorite tree?
So my favorite tree does not grow in Texas except for a teeny tiny bit up in the Davis Mountains where I've heard that you can find it. I've never been there to see it. But since I'm originally from Colorado, my favorite tree is an aspen. They're just beautiful. In the fall, they're beautiful. I love that you can hear the wind that's coming through them before it actually gets to you. And they're, fun fact, Megan was talking about the way that leaves attach, and aspen have a flattened stem on their leaves, and so it really helps the wind catch them, and they're quaking aspen is what they're called, and so the leaves really shake cool. With the wind, and then they turn beautiful gold and sometimes orange a little bit, but mostly just if you see pictures like from Colorado with the hills of gold, those are aspen trees. So
I love that. That's a good one.
I was just making sure. Okay, so my favorite tree is, I'm just gonna go with the classic good old oak tree. I grew up at my house, and we had this big oak tree that kind of covered our back patio. And so it's kind of our outdoor living room. And so I think that that's the piece that I love about oak trees, is just that feeling that you're in a patio and you've got your outdoor kind of room that they can kind of create. I mean, when I was little, I probably shouldn't say this on Facebook, like we would shower outside because we lived on a ranch. And so mom and dad would like throw the water hose over the tree limb, and we would shower outside when we were little. And so like, it really was where we lived in the summer, was under the oak tree. So I guess for not very planty reasons, I think that an oak tree is my favorite. So
yeah, they're beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, I love that. And I think trees are something that mean a lot in culture. And like, we all mentioned something that we grew up with, right? Because Megan, you grew up in South Texas, so you had olives growing up,
well,
right?
I grew up near Dallas, but I've learned to love them.
You as being from the San Antonio area, but I think like those a lot of times trees are something that like they're a big part of our lives sometimes for various reasons. They're something that a lot of us can identify, or you climbed them as a kid, or you had a tree house in them, or you took a shower underneath them. Like all of those, we relate. I think people relate to trees a lot. So
absolutely.
So we had a few answers to what their favorite tree was. April from Travis County was loving her wax myrtle that she has
Oh,
had.
yes.
And so she's got a bunch of birds who hide in and eat in it.
Those
and
are
then
nice
Randy
trees.
Keller says she loves her button bush. She goes, it's not a tree, but she fully wears that she's in the bush department. But she says she is
That
one of her favorites
counts.
as a button
We're
bush.
counting that.
Oh, and then she wanted to one up everybody, and she's going to put a bush and a tree, and her favorite tree is a ginkgo tree. I think I said that right, but in Ohio.
I was going to say, not real common in South Texas.
No, so, but that's really fun. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Thank you, Megan, for joining us and talking about plants in our monthly Beyond the Birds presentation. Let's see what we have next week. Let's see, what do we have on the schedule for next week's Cup Chat? We are going to be talking about range expansion, okay? So we talk a lot about in the birding community, birds not being where they're supposed to be. So we've got a special guest coming in that's going to kind of discuss range expansion. So we're super excited about that. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Megan. Have a happy Wednesday, and we'll talk to you later.